Terry Ryder is well known all over Australia for his great investigative journalism as well as his famous hotspotting. Terry joined me in my studio to chat about the anatomy of a hotspot. Terry, we did a couple of interviews last year and you talked about the things that cheese you off about property journalists, about property in general reporting. Is there something new this year that cheeses you off?
We can add to the list the obsession that overseas economists seem to have about Australian property prices, and particularly claiming that they're the most unaffordable in the world, which they are not. And also I think the way that the regions continue to be ignored by property investors and by property writers.
All right, well, let's start with the first one and we'll talk about economists, their take on the Australian property and what they're saying. Why do you think that's so wrong?
I think because economists firstly aren't property experts, and I think that's been very clear for the predictions they've made about Australian prices, particularly back in 2009 when our values were supposed to collapse by anything up to 40%, and of course the opposite happened. They're still making those kinds of claims about the unsustainability of our values, but it tends to be people overseas looking at Australia through a very long telescope and trying to fit Australian housing market into an economic model, which you can't really do because you can't factor in so many of the relevant factors such as the cultural factor, the ethic about owning your own home in Australia.
What is it exactly that they're getting wrong in terms of economics? They're saying that property is going to crash. A well-noted economist has come back again and said, I was right the first time, it is going to crash by 40%. Why is that so wrong?
Well, the noted economist you referred to didn't get it right. He actually predicted very clearly that our values would fall 40% in 2009 specifically, and our values continued to rise. And so often economists who are wrong with their predictions just keep predicting the same thing in the hope that eventually they'll get it right and then they can claim to be justified. But nothing has changed in the fundamentals that underpin Australian property prices, which is a very strong economy, low unemployment, wages growth has been strong in Australia recently. So the fundamentals like that support our property prices, and in addition to that we have an independent, dispassionate observer of authority, specifically the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens, saying that the relativity in Australia between incomes and prices hasn't changed much for the last 10 years and is unexceptional by world standards, which tends to contradict a lot of the rhetoric we're getting from economists.
And I guess that translates into the fact that we're probably not quite as unaffordable as the reports are saying.
No, we're not. I think the media has decided that this is an issue they're going to target, and they've been targeting it in a very emotive and negative way and latching on to any scrap of opinion or data that comes from whatever source, however lacking in credibility, to maintain the momentum of this story as they see it about our prices being unsustainable and unaffordable. But when you look around Australia, there's still plenty of affordability, and we still have one of the highest home ownership rates in the world, and that's inconsistent with the notion that our houses are unaffordable.
All right, let's get this right for the viewers. It's not just any regional area that is going to perform well. You can't just pick one and hope it does well.
That's right.
Let's talk a bit more then about the anatomy of a hotspot.
Well, that's right. I think if you looked at the average across regional areas last year, the average would be quite low, but it is the star performers that did very well, but they did well for specific reasons. Some of them were areas that were driven by the resources sector, and the number one area was the Pilbara region of Western Australia, where towns like Port Hedland and Karratha continue to show very strong growth, despite already having incredibly high prices. But that's such a strong driver, the resources sector. But most of the other regional areas on the list were just solid regional centres with agricultural economies, perhaps some tourism. But I think the standout feature is areas with a well-rounded economy. Put your focus onto regional centres that are well-rounded, have diverse factors in their economy, and have identifiable drivers for future growth, infrastructure being built, new projects being developed, and a proactive local council facilitating new business and development.
Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again at some time in the future.
You're welcome, my pleasure.